Welcome everyone to our Facebook Live session. My name is Professor James Adams. I'm glad to have you here today. What we want to do with this Facebook Live session is try to explain a little bit about the summaries that our research group did on a microbiota transplant for autism. I want to tell you a little bit about some of our upcoming plans, and then spend most of the time just answering a lot of questions that have come in from many different families. And so to begin with, just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm the father of a child with autism. My daughter is 27 years old, and that was what motivated me 20-some years ago to really begin looking for the causes of autism, how to treat it, and how to prevent it. And so here at ASU, I've been doing autism research for 20 years. I'm also the president for the last 20 years of the Autism Society of Greater Phoenix. It's the largest support group here in Arizona. Also, because of our research, we created a vitamin mineral supplement company, the Autism Nutrition Research Center. I'll mention a little bit about that later. And also, to prevent autism, we founded the Neurological Health Foundation, and I'm the chair of the scientific advisory board for that. And in about 3 months, we'll be coming out with a prenatal that we hope will greatly reduce the risk of autism and many other pregnancy complications and birth complications. So what we want to do first is just, again, tell you a little bit about the study. And to do that, I want to give you a little bit of background. So back in 2000, there was a wonderful woman named Ellen Bolte who had a daughter with autism and thought that daughter had some severe GI problems. And so she tried treating that daughter with vancomycin, and it had great temporary benefit. So she convinced Dr. Sandler to do a research study with a number of children with autism, and what they found is that an 8-week dose of oral vancomycin, which is a special powerful antibiotic that stays only in the gut, so it only affects gut bacteria, they found that led to a temporary great improvement in GI symptoms, great improvement in autism symptoms. When they stopped treating, they found that within a few weeks, all the GI benefits, all the autism benefits were lost. That was a very important clue. It told us that gut bacteria seem to be causing many of the problems, but we need to prevent them from the bad bacteria from returning when treatment is stopped. And so in 2011, we did a study showing that children with autism who had GI problems also had worse autism symptoms. And so again, that's consistent with the 2000 study. And then I worked with my close collaborator, Rosie Malnik Brown. She's our microbiome expert here at ASU. And we investigated a hypothesis that maybe the reason these children with autism had these GI problems were because they were missing beneficial bacteria, which are needed to fight the growth of pathogenic bacteria. Your healthy gut bacteria help in a lot of different ways. They help with producing certain key vitamins. They help with digesting your food. They help regulate the immune system, regulate water, keep motility going. And also what they do is they help prevent pathogenic bacteria, bad bacteria from growing. So in that study, we found that children with autism, regardless of whether or not they had GI symptoms, were missing hundreds of species of bacteria compared to typical children. So a typical child may have about 1,000 species. Kids with autism are missing about 25%. They're missing several hundred. So then, to give you a little bit more background, there's a very nasty infection, very common in the US, called a Clostridium difficile or C. diff infection. It affects about 500,000 people a year, and it causes life-threatening, explosive diarrhea. And it kills about 29,000 Americans a year. It can be treated with antibiotics, such as vancomycin, but when it's treated, it often returns. And as it returns again and again, in some cases, people get weaker and weaker until they die. So it's a very serious illness. And it was discovered 20-some years ago that if you do a fecal transplant, if you just take some raw poop from a healthy person and by an enema or colonoscopy, administer it to someone with C. diff, it's incredible that within just 2 to 3 days, they generally go from being extremely sick to They go from it being extremely sick to going and being losing most of those symptoms and very soon becoming cured. And the great thing is it almost never returns. So unlike with antibiotics. So one dose, one time, about a 90% cure rate. And so that's very promising for C. diff infections. Because of that, the FDA then went ahead and decided that it's a very promising therapy, but there's some risks. They decided to regulate it like a drug, the same way they regulate blood products, because there's some risk. And so now FMT is in a very unique legal position. It's never gone through phase 2 and phase 3 trials at the time the FDA regulated it, but instead what it has been done is, because it's been shown in over 25 studies to be very beneficial and with very minor adverse effects generally, they allow it for C. diff. It's not FDA approved, but it is allowed by the FDA to be used for C. diff patients, but only by C. diff patients. So now to give you a little bit more background, a close collaborator of mine, Tom Barotti, is a gastroenterologist in Australia. He's done over 5,000 FMTs for C. diff and many, many other conditions. He treated 9 children with autism, and he found that they were much, much harder to treat than standard C. diff patients. So instead of treating them one time, he treated them every day for 3 months. And slowly, gradually, he found improvements in GI symptoms, and surprisingly, the parents began telling him about improvements in the autism symptoms. So Tom and I spoke because I had already had an interest in this area, and he guided us in the design of our study. We went ahead and submitted to the FDA a request to do a study for children with autism, and that was approved. And so my close collaborator, Rosie Malnik Brown, and many, many other people worked to do our phase 1 treatment study. So just to summarize it briefly, what we found is in this study for 18 children with autism, we found it was very safe, it was very well tolerated, and that's usually all you might see in a phase 1 study. But in addition, we found that for the 18 children, 90% of them had a great improvement in GI symptoms. There's an overall, on average, an 80% reduction in GI symptoms. If they had constipation, it disappeared. If they had diarrhea, it disappeared. Their stools became normal, their pain disappeared. So great improvements. Also, a little bit later in the study, the parents began reporting that there were improvements in their autism symptoms as well. So by the end of treatment, about a 25% improvement in autism symptoms. And we were thrilled. And then we stopped treatment and waited 8 weeks. And 8 weeks later, we found that unlike in the Sandler study, where benefits were lost when they stopped treatment, we found that because we had followed the Vanco with FMT, we found that the benefits remained at 8 weeks. So we thought, great, we're done. Then a year later, 3 different families came up to me and said, Professor Adams, my son's doing better than ever. And after the 3rd family told me that, I thought that was really interesting. So we went ahead, Rosie and I decided to do a 2-year follow-up. So we followed up with every one of the 18 families who had been in our first study. None of them dropped out. They all agreed to be re-interviewed. What we found is that most of the GI benefits had continued, but family after family said their child had just slowly, gradually continued to improve. And in our professional evaluator, after evaluating the family, said it appears as about a 47% decrease on average in autism symptoms. So not every family benefited, but most of the children did. And so in addition, we looked at the microbiome diversity. At the start of the study, it was very low, 25% below normal. At the end of treatment, it was normal. But then 2 years later, it was better than normal. This suggests this is a really long-lasting treatment. So we hope it will last for a very long time, in the same way that someone treated with for a C. diff infection with FMT, it virtually never returns. So that's a quick summary of where we are with our work. So now what I want to do is just mention a little bit about FDA regulations. So the FDA requires that any drug go through a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 treatment study. So phase 1 is what we already did, showing it's safe. And now phase 2 is what we're currently doing for a study with adults with autism. So a phase 2 study is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. So that makes sure that the treatment effect is real, that people aren't just imagining the benefit. And so our open label study, our first study was open label, so there's probably some placebo effect. But we think most of the benefit is probably real. But this phase 2 study is really going to prove that. So we've already treated 18 adults with autism. But then, so we received a federal grant to do this study for 84 adults. And a company had volunteered to donate all the product for the study. But after we treated the first 18 patients, unfortunately, the company was no longer able to supply the study drug. So we were stuck. This happened just a few months ago. So then we spoke with our close collaborators at University of Minnesota, who originally developed this highly purified FMT product from very carefully selected donors. And they were co-authors in our first paper. And they said, Jim, we'd be glad to supply study for the new trial. They're the ones who actually developed and patented the process and taught this other company how to do it. So their product is essentially identical. It's made under GMP conditions, which is what the FDA requires. And it's been used for other clinical trials for C. diff, works very well. And so the only catch is they're a university, and so they needed to raise about $160,000 to $200,000 to supply us with drug for the rest of the study. We don't have that. So we have a choice. We can go ahead and write another grant proposal and wait perhaps a year, and typically there's about a 10% chance of getting a grant funded. Or we thought we would just go ahead, because many families had begun asking us about the study. We decided a week ago to launch a GoFundMe campaign. And amazingly, I have to thank the over 200 families who have donated that we've received. Now, I think it's over $50,000 from different sources. And that's a great first step to help us finish our adult study. Finishing that adult study is so important, because if you only have a small number of participants in the study, there's a good chance the study won't reach statistical significance. We have to get as close as possible to the full number of participants to really be able to prove that this treatment is beneficial. If this phase 2 study is successful, the great news is the FDA has already said, based on our phase 1 study, that they've awarded fast track status to Microbiota Transplant for autism. What that means is they recognize that it's a promising treatment, not proven, but promising. And it recognizes that there's an unmet need. There is no drug today to treat core symptoms in autism or to treat these very difficult GI symptoms, which I forgot to mention. In our 18 children, they had had these GI symptoms since infancy. They never had a period in their life with normal GI function. So that's very exciting. So if we succeed in this phase 2 study, then we can apply to the FDA to do a phase 3 study. Phase 3 study usually requires about 500 to 1,000 people, usually requires about $50 to $100 million in funding. If that's successful, if we can raise that money and that's successful, then we can ask the FDA to approve it for autism. So that's what it takes. So it's a big step, but we're working very hard towards it. We've been working very hard for several years towards it. In addition, we would really love to do a child study. We've been planning it for 3 years. We've had promises of funding for that, and those promises, unfortunately, have kept falling through. And so that's why we also plan to issue a GoFundMe campaign for families, because we've received over 400 requests from families asking to be in a future child study. Believe me, we've wanted to do a child study for 3 years. And if families want to go ahead and donate funding for that so we can do it, we'd be thrilled. We do need to raise close to that full $800,000 because the worst thing that could happen is if we start the study without full funding and we don't reach statistical significance, that will discourage anyone from trying again with a larger study. So we want to be cautious. We don't want to lose this chance, and so we only want to do the study when we're confident we have enough money to do it right, so we can reach statistical significance and keep getting closer and closer to FDA approval. So I know that's frustrating for families, but I hope you understand about that. So I think that's most of the background I wanted to give. The one other big thing I want to point out though is this: we will explain very carefully, answer a lot of questions about this study, and try to explain everything about it. But we are not recommending this as a do-it-yourself at-home therapy. Let me give you a very personal reason why. People thought blood transfusions were very safe. My mother received a blood transfusion to try to help her after a serious surgery. Unfortunately, she caught hepatitis C from that, and it killed her. My brother, who's a hemophiliac, caught hepatitis C from a blood transfusion, and it almost killed him. It came very close. So we thought at the time blood transfusion was safe. We didn't know hepatitis C existed. We think FMT is very safe. One thing we're doing to make it much safer than with blood transfusions is blood transfusions would pool blood from hundreds or even thousands of donors. We don't do that. The FDA has asked us to track each donation to one person. So each person gets a donation from only one, or in our study, 2 different donors. And that makes it much safer, but it's still not perfectly safe. We have a lot to learn about the microbiome. So we do not recommend any do-it-yourself. That's not what this talk is about. Okay, so Devin, with me is my study coordinator, Devin. She's a little shy, so she's going to stay behind the camera, but she's wonderfully helpful. She has with her over 20 sets of questions from families. We're going to try to go through those quickly and answer as many as we can. If we don't do all of them, and if there's an interest, I'd be glad to do another Facebook Live session to answer more. Again, I'm a parent, and I want to explain this research as best we can to families who have asked us. We've had hundreds of emails, and we've tried to answer all of them. Devin, go ahead.
All right. How does one enroll in your study, either adult or child, and how are participants ultimately selected?
Yeah, so enrolling in our adult study is very simple. You just go to our website, autism.asu.edu, and you can read a little bit more there about the study, and then go ahead and fill out the application. And then our study coordinator, Devin, or one of our other coordinators would review it, see if you meet the initial inclusion and exclusion criteria. Mostly, are you the right age? Have you had chronic GI symptoms? And there are a few other, number of other issues too, but those are the main ones. Then after that, we verify the diagnosis of autism. And about 95% of the time, our expert can do that. And then we go ahead and do blood safety tests. 95% of the time, the people pass that. And then our study physician reviews in gory detail all the medical histories to check for any potential risk factors. At the moment, one risk factor we're looking for is seizures. At the moment, we don't want to include people with seizures because we want to learn more about safety first before we reach out to that group as well. So again, we're trying to take it one step at a time, trying to be as safe as possible. Oh, and then for enrolling in the child study, we aren't allowed to recruit for the child study until we start it, but we do have a contact list. And so we have, I believe, over 400 families who have contacted us, and you can just go to our website to sign up for that contact list. And then when a study is finally approved by the FDA, approved by IRB and funded, then we'll go ahead and start. And so we've already submitted a request for the child study to the FDA, very similar to our previous request. In a month, they'll give us their feedback if they approve it or not, or if they want any changes. And so really the only thing that will be holding us back at that point is funding. It's really the only thing that will keep us from doing it. When we receive funding, I want to make it very clear, we do not sell slots. We're not allowed by the FDA to do that. We've had many offers from families. Professor Adams, can I give you $20,000 to guarantee a slot for my child in the study. We aren't allowed to do that. The FDA won't allow us. And so all we do is when we receive approval, we will advertise the study to everyone who's requested information, and then we'll begin processing applications on a first come, first served basis. We'll probably wait a week just to be fair so everyone has a chance to hear about it. In general, in our past studies, it takes a little bit of time. This time we'll probably give people a week to fill out applications. Also, I was asked to make clear there have been a couple cases of misinformation where some Facebook coordinators or other people, specifically one Facebook coordinator, Susan Katamuri, has been, people have claimed that she might be trying to personally benefit to get her child in the study. Susan's just helping out through the goodness of her heart. She sent me an affidavit, signed affidavit, guaranteeing that she will not attempt to enroll her child in the study. She's just trying to help the many other families get access to this treatment, which we hope will be very beneficial to them. All right, so I think now we're ready to take questions.
All right, can you provide an estimated timeline for the child study with the FDA fast track?
Yeah, so the fast track is great because it means the FDA will respond to our questions quickly. They'll give a faster review. So that's wonderful. But I want to point out the FDA has always been extremely helpful to me. They have been very grateful and very quick at reviewing our applications. Instead of waiting the full amount of time, they'll often just call me, say, Professor Adams, we need this or that changed. The FDA has been wonderful in helping us move this ahead quickly. The only thing slowing us down is lack of funding.
All right. Can MTT be designated for compassionate care? And if this is possible, how soon would it be available?
Yeah. So the compassionate care clause is generally limited to people who have a life-threatening condition. And autism is very serious, but it's not life-threatening. So the FDA would probably refuse that if I asked. I would have to, even if they did allow it, I'd have to submit a separate IND and get funding for it. It would require all the same paperwork as for a clinical trial. So the only difference is it would be harder to use that data to support eventual approval. So my goal is very simple. If this treatment continues to look as safe and effective as it is, then our goal is to get it approved by the FDA as soon as possible so it can reach families as soon as possible. Now, I will point out we filed several patents on this, and the reason for that is so that we would encourage, it's basically required for pharmaceutical companies to have any interest in it. And so that those patents are held by myself and many other collaborators through ASU and our university. So it would be shared through them. So I just want to be upfront about that. Next question.
What if we're not able to raise the $200,000 for the child study or $800,000 the other study? Would ASU go forward with the adult clinical trials with fewer participants? Yeah.
So right now, if we are not able to raise the full $200,000 for the adult study, then we'd have to stop. And we'd end up enrolling fewer adults, and that might make the difference between the results being statistically significant, which would allow us to move forward towards a phase 3 study, or not being statistically significant, and then probably preventing or making it much harder to get FMT approved for autism. So our first priority has to be for the funding for the adult study to get that fully funded so we can finish it. Because indirectly, that will then help a lot with getting approved for everyone with autism. For the child study, again, we estimate that we need about $800,000 to enroll 50 participants. Now, the alternative is our collaborator, Finch, is trying to raise $10 million to do the same study. So if someone wants to invest, not donate, but invest $10 million with Finch, please go ahead and do it. But right now, unfortunately, Big Pharma is not very interested in investing in this. There are perhaps various reasons why. It's a very expensive treatment to make. It's difficult to mass produce. You have to get it from individual donors like you do for blood donors, but it can be done. We collect blood all around the country. We can collect stool from all around the country. The other problem is it's one time. that one treatment seems to last for years. And so there's not a lot of money to be made in curing, as opposed to continuing to provide psychiatric medications for 50 years. So it's not going to be a big money maker for Big Pharma. And I think that's a big problem that we have in trying to raise money for it. Next question.
Someone just commented, I think might help as you go forward, asking what FINCH is. You mentioned FINCH.
Okay, I apologize. FINCH Therapeutic is the company that supported us in our, that gave us the product for our first study. It was actually a precursor to FINCH that merged with FINCH. And they gave us the product for our first, our adult study, for the first part of it, but they aren't able to do it. Their main focus is to get FMT approved for C. diff. That's their primary focus. They've been very gracious in working with me and trying to assist as much as they're able to with our autism study.
All right, moving on. What can parents do now to directly help their kids if not in the study?
So there are a lot of things that can be done to help treat GI issues. On my website, and this is my personal website, adamsautismresearch.com, we have a 50-page handout listing 18 different recommendations based on research that treatments that we think are important. And so there are, and also discusses there at some length, alternative GI treatments. Bottom line is half of a person's stool is gut bacteria. If the stool looks abnormal, smells abnormal, then you probably have abnormal gut bacteria. It's a very simple but very good test. You can do a comprehensive digestive stool analysis, and that can look at some bacteria. It's not very reliable. You can also look at yeast. We found in one of our studies that about 25% of people with autism do have yeast, and it seems to be associated with worse neurological problems, worse autism symptoms, but not worse GI symptoms. So I believe that probably a quarter of people with autism, and there are several studies now, including ours, showing about a quarter of people with autism seem to have a hidden yeast infection you can only find through testing. So I do recommend testing and then talking with your physician about treating it with antifungals such as nystatin or diflucan. The problem is it often keeps coming back, so it seems you need to have a low sugar diet. The other type of approach that I strongly recommend is we did a comprehensive nutritional intervention study, and that involved 6 different nutritional interventions. And the 3 most important ones we found were the vitamin mineral supplement we developed, and we sell it through our nonprofit. But again, I don't collect any royalties or payments from it. I'm a volunteer for ANRC. And also fish oil. And then finally, a healthy allergen-free diet, avoiding common such as wheat and dairy. And so basically, those are the things that treatments that we found led to many of the same types of improvements as in our FMT study, but just not to the same level of improvement. For example, we found about a 30% improvement in GI symptoms from that study. So that's a study that's available today, and we think it makes great sense to try those 3 treatments. Now on the ANRC website, we have a detailed protocol we recommend to families called the ANRC protocol, and also recommends carnitine as well. Next question.
Do you have any recommendations as far as FMT clinics overseas?
I know that there are some FMT clinics overseas. I can't recommend them because I don't know more about them. They don't publish any results. So I'm afraid that's all I can tell you.
What about parents attempting DIY FMT at home?
Again, I recommended avoiding do-it-yourself FMT at home because there is some risk. In the same way there's some risk for blood transfusion, there's some risk for FMT. I think the risk is less than for a blood transfusion, but I think the risk is real. So please wait until we have done the research, which we're trying very hard to do.
Do you think it's necessary to clear the gut from yeast and parasites before doing FMT?
I don't think it's necessary to clear the gut beforehand because we didn't do that in our study. In our 2011 study, we evaluated 20 children with autism for parasites. We didn't find it present in any of them. This is with doctor's data, very good lab for testing. really focused on finding parasites. So I think parasites are relatively rare in autism. They could exist, but they're rare. But yeast, as I said, I think is very common. We did not pre-test for yeast. We had very limited budget. And I'm very curious to find out if the yeast levels in fact changed during our study. But we found that we saw these improvements without testing or treating with yeast. If yeast is still present, that would be great because it means there's more we can do to make these kids even better. Please realize that in our phase 1 study, it was our first guess about dosage and duration. And so now that we've done that study, we now think we have better guesses for dosing and duration, and we hope that will lead to even more improvements in our future studies.
Is MTT being trialed or recommended for any children with bad gut bacteria when tested, but that don't show any outward GI symptoms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we would love to do a study on children with autism who don't have obvious GI symptoms, but have low diversity of gut bacteria. In the study I did with Dr. Rosie Malnik-Brown in 2013, and we've confirmed it in another study, all kids with autism, regardless of whether or not they had GI problems, seem to have low diversity of gut bacteria. They're just missing hundreds of species. So I think it's very possible that children with autism who don't have obvious GI symptoms might, and I emphasize might, still have pathogenic bacteria that are causing a worsening of autism symptoms. And so we need to do a study to do that. I'd do that study in a heartbeat if we had the funding. But for the moment, we're doing what we think is the highest priority, which are children who also have GI symptoms.
What dietary, nutritional, or biomedical strategies do you recommend to help diversify or improve our child's microbiome?
Yeah. So one of the things I already mentioned was our comprehensive nutritional intervention study, which includes especially a healthy diet, eating whole fruits and whole vegetables. Those are the best sources of fiber in the diet, and fiber is so extremely important that we know that the average American consumes less than half the normal amount of fiber. In our study, we found that children with autism with GI problems consume less fiber than typical children. Fiber is so important because certain bacteria in your gut convert it into something called short-chain fatty acids. And one of those, butyrate, is the main food for the cells that line the gut. So fiber ends up being converted into the food, this butyrate, that provides 60 to 70% of the energy for the cells that line the gut. So if a child or adult is not eating fiber, they are literally starving the cells that line their gut. And that's probably why so many Americans today have gut problems, because they're consuming, for women, half the recommended of fiber. For men, it's even worse, about a third the recommended amount of fiber. So the other thing I'll mention is that in our child study, in our phase 1 study, we looked at risk factors for why did these children develop these GI symptoms. And we found 5 risk factors, many of which we suspected. You inherit most of your microbiome from your mother. And so we evaluated the mother's diet, and we found that mothers of children with autism, on average, consume less fiber than did typical moms. So they probably had worse gut bacteria to begin with. Then, in our study, we found 60%, over 60% of the children with autism were born by C-section, much higher rate than normal. When you're born by C-section, you inherit very little of your mother's microbiota, in particular, a special form that's needed to digest a special ingredient in mother's milk that helps feed and generate a special bacteria in your gut called B. infantis. So we also checked how long the children with autism were breastfed, and they were breastfed many fewer months than the typical children. So they had less, the mother had probably worse gut bacteria to begin with. The children with autism inherited less of it. They had less mother's milk to get the right bacteria. Then they had more antibiotics than typical kids, and then they were on a low fiber diet. Everything that could be wrong went wrong, And it's very clear that those are all major factors why they had these gut bacteria problems. So that tells us then, what can we do to prevent it and try to treat it? A high fiber diet, especially high amounts of fiber from fruits and vegetables. So instead of drinking orange juice, eat the whole orange and all the fiber in it.
All right, could you please share your thoughts on NemCheck protocol, inulin, omega-3, olive oil, and its possible effects on the gut microbiome?
I haven't seen a detailed write-up on the NemCheck profile, but I think in philosophy it's very similar to the ANRC protocol. The difference is, for the ANRC protocol, we've done a large study and found substantial benefits, substantial improvements in a number of biomarkers. For the NemCheck, I haven't seen any published results. So it may be a reasonable protocol, but I would just suggest to compare it against the ANRC protocol.
Can it work for cerebral palsy, ADHD, ADD, or developmental delay?
We don't know, but we do suspect strongly that the gut bacteria do affect many different conditions beyond just autism. I was at a conference in Europe looking at the relationship between the gut and the brain. So for example, for Parkinson's disease, GI problems occur 20 years before the Parkinson's symptoms do. And so that seems to be just one of many examples. So relationship to schizophrenia, relationship to anxiety and perhaps depression, and many other disorders. So we think that this type of intensive treatment we've recommended may help treat not just GI problems and autism, but GI problems from many other conditions too. So FMT has been used to treat more severe GI problems like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, but they're usually using just one dose or sometimes 2 or 3 doses, and the cure rate is small. Some people get cured or have some temporary benefit, but the rate's much lower. That's why we termed our therapy Microbiota Transplant therapy. We want to give it a special name to people realize we're doing some very special things. We're pre-treating with Vanco, we're doing a bowel cleanse, we're doing something special to deal with stomach acid. In the first study, we gave a stomach acid suppressant, and then also we're doing not just one dose of FMT, we're doing it every day for 7 to 8 weeks, and that seems to be what's needed for most children with autism. In our study for adults, it's seeming that we probably need even longer treatment than that.
What is your point of view for helminth?
Helminth therapy is a very intriguing therapy. We've had helminths in our gut for millions of years, and it's only in the last 100 or so years that people have removed a lot of these parasites. Many of these parasites are dangerous. We have to be cautious. There are some helminths from other species that can seem to just pass through our gut. I think they're intriguing. I think they're worthy of future research, and I emphasize research.
Will the bacteria population stick and multiply properly?
The great thing about FMT is that we're giving bacteria from a healthy person, and those bacteria seem to be long-lasting. We've checked and verified that the microbiome at the end of treatment, or even 8 weeks after treatment, is similar to the donors. But interestingly, 2 years afterwards, it's distinct from the donors because the children have been eating their own food, so you'd expect it to become somewhat different eventually, but still remains at very high diversity. One thing I didn't mention that's also very special about our study, and I don't think people really caught on to this, is we don't use FMT from one donor. We use FMT from one donor for the loading dose and from a different donor for the maintenance dose. And our thinking is very simple. Even though we're using using gut bacteria from the top 10% healthiest population, it's still probably not a healthy enough diet. American diets are terrible and very low in fiber. So what we did is, our thinking is that if this person has this many healthy gut bacteria and this person has this many healthy gut bacteria, let's give you gut bacteria from 2 healthy people, and then we hope you'll get even more. And in fact, that's what we found. We ended up with higher diversity than from typical children in our study. So we think that that's very helpful.
Will the participant require special care after the treatment to protect the bacteria colonies?
It's a great question. One of the things we're very worried about is what about antibiotics? So at the end of our study, one of our families caught a strep infection, and the family was very worried about being treated with antibiotics, but they waited and they went ahead and treated with antibiotics, and they didn't lose any benefit. We were very worried and very pleased, but there clearly is some danger with continued antibiotic use. So in future, I'd probably recommend doing injectable antibiotics rather than oral ones, and hopefully that will help reduce the risk. But so far, most of our families are doing very well.
Will Prevotella bacteria be added to the next MTT trial? It was not in phase 1, but samples after the trial showed that participants gathered that bacteria.
Very, very interested in Prevotella. In the studies that we did with, in collaboration with Rosie, her group measured what was missing in children with autism. And although children with autism were missing hundreds of species, this child might be missing these 100, this child might be missing these 100. The one thing they had in common, and we've now found this in 3 studies, is they were low in Prevotella. And what's special about Prevotella is that people on traditional Aboriginal diets with extremely high fiber intake, half their gut bacteria is Prevotella, 50%. In the same study, they looked at Europeans, and the European infants had the same microbiome as the African infants, but then when they started a regular diet, the Europeans had less than 1% of their bacteria is Prevotella versus 50% in the healthy African diet where they don't develop GI disorders. Americans, again, also just 1%, less than 1%, in kids with autism, even 10 times lower than that. So Prevotella also anti-correlated with pathogenic bacteria. So when pathogens were high, Prevotella was low, and when Prevotella was high, there were few pathogens. So we don't know which is cause and which is effect, but at least Prevotella seems to be a marker of healthy gut bacteria. When people, there's a very interesting study among people who exercise to varying degrees. People who exercised a lot and probably had healthy diets too, had higher levels of Prevotella. So in our study, the kids with autism started out with very low levels or no measurable Prevotella, and it went up roughly 200-fold. And at the 2 years later, it was still up 80-fold. We think that's very important and a very good sign. It ended up being higher than that of the donors. And again, we think that's because we're getting gut bacteria from 2 healthy donors. And we think that's our guess, but that's what we're finding.
How would children with autism and autoimmune disorders or seizures potentially do with MTT?
So I want to talk a little bit about the temporary adverse effects with Vanco, because it's very interesting. In the Sandler study in 2000, when they treated children with Vanco by itself, they found that when they treated with Vanco, in the first day or two, sometimes up to, in the first day or two, usually, some of the kids got a little worse. They had an increase in hyperactivity, and it lasted usually just sometimes for a few days. In our study, we found the same thing. We found that roughly 2/3 of the children had a temporary worsening of irritability or hyperactivity, usually just for a day or two, sometimes a few days, and then it got better. In one case, it lasted 2 or 3 weeks, but in general, it's very brief. And we now know which children have that temporary adverse reaction. It's the children who have more of those symptoms to begin with. So our hypothesis is that the children who have more of those symptoms of hyperactivity and irritability are children who have worse gut bacteria. The Vanco kills those gut bacteria. Those gut bacteria release all of their toxins all at once, so symptoms temporarily worsen for a day or two, and then the kids get better. And so we think that's what's going on. That's our hypothesis. And so because of that, we want to be cautious with people who have seizures. It's very possible that these seizures might be related to bad gut bacteria. So it's possible that when we give them Vanco, there might be a temporary worsening of seizures before improvement. The same might be true of any other condition as well. We do know that for people with severe GI symptoms like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, FMT about 20% of the time can cause a temporary flare-up of those symptoms before they get better. So again, there's some risk to FMT, primarily from the Vanco right at the start when the bad bacteria are being killed off. But we think, and that's why we want to be cautious, and we're temporarily excluding people with seizures. But as we learn more, we hope to eventually be able to include people with seizures too.
Can you describe the selection criteria for the donors? Do they follow specific diets?
Yeah. So the selection criteria that we follow, that are followed by our collaborators at the University of Minnesota, are very strict. They follow the recommendations of the American Gastroenterological Association, which I think is very important. And so these recommendations are very detailed, but briefly, it includes the same sort of testing you do for a blood donor. In addition, you check to make sure they don't have any GI problems or any history of GI problems, any history of GI cancer in their families. In addition, you check that they have a normal body weight, that they're not too fat, not too thin. There's some indication in animals studies that you can transfer obesity or transfer slimness just by transferring the microbiome. We want to make sure, so we test a lot of things. It's part of the reason FMT is so expensive is that 90% of the donors, you test them and you end up rejecting them. And then you have to do a lot of additional testing of the stool to check for any pathogen. And then after that, then we wait a few weeks to make sure that the donor's still healthy. They weren't just coming down with some disease. And so obviously we try to use the donors for as long as we can. We greatly appreciate them donating.
Sorry, why did you use vancomycin for everyone versus going with another antibiotic?
Yeah, so we used vancomycin for two reasons. One reason is it's very safe when given orally because it's not absorbed into the rest of the body. So there's very little chance of causing kidney or liver function. Also, we used it because it was what was used in the original study by Sid Feingold and the Sandler study. And they used it because they suspected that this was a Clostridia type infection. Sid Feingold is one of my heroes in the autism community. Unfortunately, he just passed away. But he has done a number of studies suggesting that there's increased of a variety of different Clostridia in kids with autism. Not a small increase, sometimes 10, even up to 45 times higher levels of Clostridia. And some of these Clostridia are very nasty species like Clostridia difficile. We don't think most kids with autism have C. diff, but we think they do have, we suspect based on Sid's work, they do have other types of Clostridia, and Vanco is effective against it. The problem is Vanco also affects some other bacteria as well. It's not as narrow spectrum as we would like. So in an adult study, we're doing an experiment. Half of the adults receive Vanco, half are just getting the bowel cleanse and FMT without Vanco. And we'll find out, is Vanco needed? The FDA would prefer we not use Vanco because it's a very potent antibiotic and they like to reserve it for critical cases. But we're going to find out if we need it or not. That's why we're doing research.
Why was the treatment given orally in addition to the colon route?
So we did not know at the start of our study which would be the best way to treat. That in the study that Tom Brody had used, he did a highly purified set of just 20 bacteria, had the children drink it in chocolate milk. You can imagine why the color choice there, and they drank it down just fine. We do know that for C. diff, if it can be given through an enema, or it can be, FMT can be given through a colonoscopy, or it can be given through a nasal gastric tube down through the stomach into the intestines. And that works almost as well. Nasal gastric tube is about 80% effective. But the reason we wanted to do it orally is because we knew we had to treat the children every day. We couldn't give them a colonoscopy every day, and we didn't want to do a rectal enema every day. We thought that was too invasive. So instead, we used a highly purified form, 99% gut bacteria. I smelled it. It had no noticeable, and so the children drank it right down in chocolate milk or whatever juice they wanted, and they drank it down just fine without any problems. Now, for our adult study, we're using a highly purified form that's a freeze-dried powder, and so it's just like a probiotic pill, except instead of a typical probiotic with 1 to 10 strains from strains that grow in milk, this is the full set of 1,000 or so strains from a very healthy person.
How did diet change for participants in the study?
Because we're trying to get FDA approval, we asked families not to make any changes during the study in any treatment at all, including diet. So they stayed on the same diet they were on, which was generally not a very good diet. And so at the end of the study, we did explain to families, the importance of fiber, the importance of improving their diet. And by the end of 2 years, a few families had followed that advice to some extent, but generally they had not made any major diet changes. And amazingly, the gut bacteria remained still very improved. So although I think high fiber diet is important for preventing these GI problems from occurring, the feedback I've seen is that it doesn't seem to help very much with treating GI problems once they've set in, and it didn't seem to be essential for FMT. We recommend it, but again, in our treatment studies with the FDA, we can only change one thing at a time if we're trying to prove that FMT is the cause of the improvement and not the diet. So if I was a clinician and FMT were improved, then absolutely I'd recommend a high fiber diet.
From the data you have seen so far, what are the best predictors of success?
It's very hard to know because 90% of the children in our study had a huge improvement in GI symptoms. I mean, 90% of the children, 16 out of 18 children, had a huge improvement. In the 2 children who didn't have an improvement in GI symptoms, one of them had very severe GI issues. She could only poop standing up, and at the end of the study, she was able to finally poop in the toilet. So that was good, but it wasn't something we measured. She was still constipated. So it could be she just needed longer treatment. So I think in really severe GI cases, they probably just need longer treatment. But also that was a child who did not fully comply with the bowel cleanse and fully comply with the fasting. Some of our families take their child to a hotel room, so there's no food in the entire room. It's hard to get a child to not sneak a cookie or food when they're hungry. It's hard to keep them from raiding the fridge. So I think the most important factor is just complying with the protocol of fasting and the full bowel cleanse. Some of the children had trouble drinking the full Moby prep that we use to cleanse their bowel. And so I think that's probably the most important factor. Age did not seem to be a factor. It seemed to help the 7-year-olds as much as the 16-year-olds. And so we're very excited about that.
How were people selected for the trial?
We selected children who ages 7 to 17 who had a history for over a year of chronic GI problems, such as chronic constipation, chronic diarrhea, or alternating between the two. We also, the FDA, because it was an investigational study, required that the children be able to assent, be able to agree to the basic question, do you want to take a medication to help your tummy feel better? The children had to be able to answer that question positively and seem to understand the question. That was the initial requirement from the FDA because this is one of the first studies of FMT in children. Since then, there have been a couple other studies of FMT in children for other conditions. So we are now asking the FDA to approve children as young as 5 years. We'd like to go even younger, but we're now using a pill that needs to be swallowed intact because we need to bypass the stomach acid. We don't want to use a stomach acid suppressant. There are some potential limitations to that. So we're using a special pill that can bypass the stomach acid, protect the gut bacteria, and then release in the small intestine. And we want to get gut bacteria there because there are some important gut bacteria in the small intestine too, and a rectal enema won't reach there.
Will hyperbaric chamber increase bad bacteria in the gut before FMT, or should we avoid HBOT?
We don't know about the effects of HBOT. We do know that most bacteria in the gut are anaerobic. They're killed by oxygen, but the HBOT only increases, standard HBOT only goes up about 30% increase in pressure. So that's probably, I would think that's not enough to have an effect, but we don't know for sure. So we'll have to wait and see until someone does an experiment.
What is the age range you're hoping to do for the upcoming children's trial?
So for upcoming children's study, we'd like to do ages 5 to 17. If that study goes well and we see good safety, then in future we'd like to do even younger children. But we want to be cautious. We want to go step by step. Right now we've had no major adverse effects, and that's what the FDA is very concerned about. Is it safe? FMT seems to be a very safe condition, a very safe treatment, and we just want to be cautious as we move ahead with autism. Cautious as we learn. We know that many people with autism can eventually develop seizures. We don't want to trigger a seizure and have that prevent FMT from eventually being approved. So being cautious, but we do eventually want to try to get this treatment out to everyone with autism who might benefit from it.
What makes your FMT different from others?
I think I've already answered that, but the main issues are we use a very special screening process to get super healthy gut bacteria from super healthy donors. We use 2 super healthy donors, first one for the loading dose, another for the daily maintenance. We do a special pre-treatment with Vanco, followed by a bowel cleanse, followed with fasting before that. We do a high dose of FMT because we think that's when it's especially needed, but our data suggests that the maintenance dose is also important. Tom Brody found he needed to treat patients for 3 months. We found people with autism were still improving at the end of our 8-week study. So our next study will be even longer. We think if we go longer than 8 weeks, we may see even more improvement than we saw in our 8-week treatment study. That's our hope. A good way to think about it is that if you have a treatment that seems very safe at 1 dose and showing some good benefit, why not consider a higher dose and a longer treatment? Is it possible to see even more benefit? We'll find out.
We only have a couple minutes left, so at this point, is there anything else you'd like to leave them with? Any other information you'd like to tell them before we finish up?
There's still a number of questions we didn't get to?
There are a number of questions we didn't get to. There's a number of questions that people are commenting on here.
Okay.
In addition, but we only technically have 2 minutes left.
All right. So I apologize that we're out of time, but if people have an interest, and it sounds like there is, then I'll work on rescheduling another Facebook Live session to try to answer any questions that have come in. I'm sorry, we've just received so many questions. We're trying to answer them all, but I want to answer them carefully so people really understand it. So again, I just want to close to thank everyone for your support. It means so much to me as an autism dad. Again, over 200 families who have reached out to help us continue our study for adults. We're very hopeful this will help lead us to eventually getting us approved by the FDA. But we need to go step by step, first with our adult study, and then if we go ahead to launch a GoFundMe campaign for the child study soon. And if we can raise the money for that, then we'll do the child study too right away. Again, I want to thank all my collaborators. We have a very large team of many people, but especially I want to thank Rosie Malnik Brown, our microbiome expert here at ASU, and her postdoc who became a research scientist, Daewoo Kang, and now because of the great success of her work, he's now a professor at University of Toledo. So those 2 collaborators have been especially great. And our study physician, Shara McDonald Means, it's amazing to me she could do a rectal enema over an hour with 6 kids without sedation, and they were just good as gold. So again, we want to thank everyone for helping with the study. And yes, I'm being reminded to please consider donating if you wish. You can donate to our Facebook page or to our Pitch Funder page. ASU cannot directly accept funds through GoFundMe. The reason is it would just go into the general university pool and never come to us. GoFundMe can't differentiate. So that's why we're having the GoFundMe funds go to the Autism Nutrition Research Center, which I'm the volunteer president of, and 100% of those funds will go to ASU. If you don't believe me, just go ahead and donate to the ASU Pitch Funder site. That's perfectly fine too. And also, some people are just sending in checks or wiring in funds. We're delighted to take donations anyway. We cannot accept payment for a slot for a person. Everyone will be treated equally when we advertise our study, but the more donations that are made, the more slots we'll have for our study. It's the simple numbers of it. So thank you all very much. I hope I've answered your questions, and we'll just schedule another one to answer any more that people have. I'll just finally mention I am giving a talk at Autism 1 in a couple weeks. That will be televised. Well, it'll be eventually broadcast. It'll be recorded and released. I'm giving a talk in September in Phoenix and a talk at the annual TACA meeting in, I think it's October or November. So I'm glad there'll be other opportunities too. So thank you all very much, and you can go to our webpage to learn more. Thank you.